Proportional Response. Book 1, Chapter 14, Part 6, A Human Breakfast Delicacy. Eldia walked the halls between the Venter and the human embassies. I feel like I have worn a path in the floor here these last few weeks. A lopsided smile pulled at the corner of her mouth, but worry kept it part of the way down. I still don't like that he sent me away to make his calls a few days ago, nor that he has been so tight-lipped about it since. Of course, Kazla and Inable are just as put out with me for my inability to tell them anything about that mysterious project. She sighed softly. Which is exactly why Henry has refused to talk, I guess. He knew they'd be on me for information, and I can't tell them what I don't know. Still, it is vexing. She shook her head and banished those thoughts from her mind. Tonight is not about any of that, though. Tonight is about me, him, and relaxing. I know he is working to take a fleet into that star system, and I know how it hurts him to have to. He needs rest. She walked through the doors to the embassy, giving a passing nod to the guards. Some soldier, who had been sitting in the front room playing some sort of game with his fellows, abruptly stood and began to follow her. She gave him the side eye and spoke. "I know the way just fine, young man. Thank you." The guy swallowed hard and turned an earnest face to her. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but rules are rules, and right now all Confederated government agencies are at heightened alert status, which means non-citizens must be escorted at all times, regardless of who they are." The boy gave a fast glance at the door, so quick she nearly missed it, particularly when they are citizens of a government which has not declared for either side yet. She almost turned to face the young man and dress him down, but caught herself up short. He is playing for the cameras. No doubt there are a dozen devices looking through that doorway. She settled on a hard look and a curt nod before setting off at a fast pace. Henry's office door was closed, something she was hardly used to encountering. She considered just walking in, but a subtle cough to her left caught her attention. One of his secretaries met her eyes, without moving his head, and gave a small shake of that head, while making sure she saw him hit a button to let Henry know she had arrived. She gave the young man a half smile, nodded, and turned to her escort. "I'm sure the handful of office people here are sufficient to count as an escort, young man, and you can get back to what you were doing, yes?" She arched an eyebrow at him, daring him to contradict her. The young soldier kept his face calm, but his eyes darted furtively before he nodded and backed up a step. She forced herself to take a deep breath and soften her countenance, then held out her hand with a palm towards the soldier. "I'm sorry. These are trying days for us all, and you are doing your job. If I promise to stay here, read my pad, and be a good girl, I can let you get back to your buddies in the front room. No? If I give up and decide to leave, I promise to wait until one of these good folks," she waved at the handful of occupied desks, "arranges me an escort. Fair enough." She then extended her hand to him. The soldier's face softened, and he acknowledged her apology with a small smile and a nod. He shook her hand. Did that strange full body at once turn that the human soldiers seemed to like, and walked out of the room. She had a brief conversation with the secretary, which ended with a nod from them both. Thankfully, Henry didn't keep her waiting long. The door to his office slid open, and she had to exert every scrap of willpower she possessed to keep from bounding through it. Before she got within sight of Henry, she stopped and locked eyes with the secretary. She lifted an eyebrow at him, motioned her head towards the door, rolled her eyes, and pantomimed going to sleep. The secretary rolled his eyes in turn, mimed drinking coffee, and sat there bug-eyed, staring at her. She responded with a smile, cocked her hips towards the door, motioned like she was closing it, then made a shooing motion with her hands. The secretary gave her a half smile and nodded with a conspiratory glint in his eye. She saw him hit a few buttons, some of them on the desk phone. Then he stood and motioned for her to go in. When she got inside, a secretary closed the door behind her, and Henry looked up with reddened eyes. "I know, love, I know. The Duke and Annabel want to know." She cut him off with a swipe of her hand and a furious look, then bent over the desk, grabbed his face in both hands, and planted a deep kiss on his mouth. She kept planting it until he gave up struggling and brought his hands to her shoulders. then let it linger for a while longer. He reached up, and without breaking contact with her lips, bodily pulled her over the desk to sit in his lap, then began to return the kiss in earnest. At length they separated, and she found that she'd wrapped an arm behind his neck. She looked down at him and spoke.
Neither Caslor nor Annibal sent me. You could say I was sent by their wives and girlfriend, and it would be a half-truth. The women of both of those men have dragged them to their respective bedrooms and threatened the embassy staff within an inch of their lives if they are disturbed. Before morning, none of them said anything to me directly, but Her Grace Golna did mention that she is sure you are under far more stress from all of this than either of them are. So, I'm here to make sure you are taking care of the man I care so much about.
She put on a hard look.
And I see that you are not.
Henry cocked his head sideways and gave her a shrewd look.
Why is it that the two of them have been so terribly busy? We haven't spoken, and there is no other crisis going on that I know about. At least, not one that they would need to give any attention to.
She shook her head and quirked an eyebrow at him.
They expect that you are going to have to prosecute what amounts to a civil war against those bastards John described. And they expect, with the way you stormed out of there, that you will have to do so sooner or later. They know what the council rules are for that, and even the weird way you people arranged your governments doesn't change that.
Henry looked at her with a bemused grin, so she sighed and continued.
They also know they are the best choice for arbitrators, if you plan to use the ask forgiveness instead of permission version of those rules. You could, of course, go to the URSO or the Themerk, but those rules specify a reasonably neutral party. The Zoltans will, of course, try to make a lot of noise about how they should have been the observers, but...
Henry nodded.
But that will actually give us some ammo to sling at them, which will be the one almost positive thing we will be able to wring out of this mess.
He reached up and kissed her on the cheek.
Of course, there is a long road to travel between here and there, and it is going to get ugly. The intel boys are still interrogating John, and he is starting to get surly about it, which they tell me is a good thing. I think they plan to send him back to you guys soon.
She flexed her thigh, a little against him, disguising the movement with a peck on his forehead. She was rewarded by feeling him shift beneath her leg. He gave her an amused smile and continued.
So far, everything they can corroborate checks out, and he has given them a great deal of valuable intel. They are trying to let them put him in trance and walk through some key elements, but he doesn't seem to want to cooperate.
Eldia threw her head back and laughed, taking advantage to rub against him again, and was rewarded by more shifting.
Fat chance of that. That rascal has authority issues and control issues that have issues of their own.
Henry gave her a sly smile.
Oh, they have one thing that might convince him, after they finish pissing him off, and let him calm down. They are prepared to exchange his cooperation and a plea of guilty to certain crimes for a sentence of time served under the imprisonment of the Fatharin Empire.
Her smile cut abruptly, and she stared deep into his eyes. Those deep, compassionate, strong, sigh. She held her face neutral while she spoke.
They would do that. I mean, after...
Henry nodded.
I am not entirely happy about it, but I can't begrudge them or even him. He was actually careful while in Halasafaran space to minimize casualties and freed a lot of slaves. Unfortunately, most of the people they freed signed on with them, and most of those who didn't try to disappear back into that system somewhere, and none of the few who escaped to other parts of human space tried to come forward. Not surprising, really. I'm sure they thought all authority was like where they came from.
He had stopped looking at her eyes and let his gaze trail down her cheeks, to her chin, and to her cleavage, which she had carefully left open with a deeply five-neck top. He placed a quick kiss just below her neck and continued to speak.
Of course, he was able to give us details on a few people that they smuggled out early on. We are trying to track some of them down in the hopes that they have seen enough since then to be willing to talk.
He sighed.
That said, Intel got enough out of yesterday's interviews with John to recommend that we begin military preparations. I have been going crazy trying to have clandestine phone calls with dozens of heads of state of various confederated worlds, and that is just the start. Between the president and myself, we have preliminary buy-in from enough nations to force a vote in the Senate and make sure it passes, but that is all pending on the reports from the Intel guys. and that is waiting on John.
He shook his head ruefully and ran his fingers through his hair. She couldn't help herself. She moved a stray lock out of his face, then ran her hand down his jawline as he continued.
Who knew that the most wanted man in human space would end up being the man on whom our entire military mobilizes? Still, the militaries of the nations who have vowed to participate are starting to mobilize. Hell, at the rate they are moving, they'll be ready almost before the vote is.
He looked away from her a bit, and his voice took on a pensive tone.
We made it hard to do this sort of thing, and made it that way on purpose, but we did put in provisions for it. Secret votes, supermajorities required, presentations of evidence. There are layers red tape between here and dispatching that fleet. I just really never thought I'd be the one having to wade through them.
He cursed softly under his breath. She saw a rare moment of vulnerability show in his eyes, and she ran his fingers through his hair to cup the back of his neck.
And now, you are regretting putting all that red tape, as you call it, in place, and rethinking those decisions.
He got a pensive look for a moment, then shook his head.
No, quite the contrary. In fact, it is a royal pain in the ass, but it is a necessary pain in the ass.
He got a far off, but still pensive look.
We debated each step, each checkpoint, each requirement for days on end. Taking them out, putting them back in, discarding some and adding others. We tried to make the process both streamlined and robust, hard enough to force it to be given the consideration it requires, but not to bog it down in process. Security is a major concern too, of course. More lives will be lost if the receiving nation is aware we are coming.
His eyes returned to her.
I didn't just expect this protocol to be used in my lifetime. I hoped it would never be needed. I hoped we were past this, but now we are paying for the mercies that were shown the accomplices to Ken Fistration.
He let out a long sigh, then looked her in the eye again, and the old resolve had returned.
No, I believe in the process we created even more now. The most important thing is that the militaries are allowed to mobilize and prepare even before the vote, which will probably be our saving grace.
His eyes softened, and he gave her a quick peck on the lips.
Still, there are reports I need to review about the conversations I am going to have tomorrow, and...
She put a finger on his mouth and gave him her best stern look.
And you don't have another call scheduled for at least a dozen hours. Don't expect any further intel reports until sometime after that. Haven't even seen your bed in over 24 hours and only got a few hours in there the last time you did. You will be no good in what is coming if you have run yourself out already, and I have spoken to your staff. They can get by without you for a few hours, and so you're all mine for the evening.
He got a stubborn look on his face and began to protest, but she hardened her features and kept that finger firmly in place.
I mean it, honey. Your secretary said I should threaten to have him call the medic if you try to tell me no. I'm not sure what exactly that means, but I can guess.
Anger flashed in his eyes, and, somehow, that sent an electric charge straight through her, right down to, no, best not to think about that. Yet, the anger receded, and he gave her a lopsided smile and a small kiss. She smiled back at him, stood, took his hand, and led him from the office to his apartments. She shot a look at the secretary on duty, who smirked at her and nodded in agreement. They would not be disturbed, unless absolutely necessary. As soon as the door to Henry's apartment closed, she pinned him against the wall and bussed him properly, pressing against him as hard as she could. She could feel his pants shift under her again, and let herself feel a bit of pride. When they finally came up for air, she sat him on the couch and went to his small kitchen.
You order us some dinner, love. Some of those steaks would be lovely. I had some ingredients delivered over the last few days, so I'm going to make us a little dessert.
She stopped on the way to the kitchen and turned to look at him with mock severity.
Now, tonight is about us, not the galaxy out there.
She made a sweeping gesture with her hand.
Not about the affairs of state or anything else.
She put a hand on her hip and cocked it just so.
I will take your message that you wish His Grace and Denibel to act as observers in your civil war, but that is later. Tonight, you get to relax with a beautiful woman and leave your cares on the other side of that door. So, put your feet up, turn the lights down, order the food, and give me some of that romantic music you played for me that time, and let's enjoy ourselves.
Henry gave her an inscrutable look for a moment, smiled, nodded, and turned to pull up a holodisplay from his coffee table. As she turned and made her way to his mini kitchen, the lights behind her dimmed and wordless instrumental music began to play. She busied herself in the kitchen, letting herself get lost in the task. He came in after a while and offered to help. She pulled him up a chair and asked him to simply keep her company. She looked deeply into his eyes and sighed. I could never have believed that he is as old as he is, if not for the deep well behind his eyes. I am glad he confided in me these last few weeks to tell me his real age and his history. I am going to be a lifetime getting all of the stories of the things he's seen out of him. They need to be recorded. I'm also glad he will live so long. My one hesitation in this relationship was fear of outliving him and being an old maid. She shook herself and turned to baking, asked him a question, and they were off. She made him stick to two of their favorite topics, comparing the entertainments that their two peoples enjoyed and the wild adventures that they wanted to have one day. He seemed to have an inexhaustible well of places to see on his home world of Earth alone, and she, well, she had an entire empire's worth of locations to draw from, and that was before they started getting to the places on other council worlds. They verbally danced through dinner and her dessert pastries, then settled in on the couch to play music for each other. She sat there with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat with one ear and the music, or his voice, with the other. So strange, a single heartbeat. The rhythm is different, but still soothing. As they sat there, a warmth grew in her heart as a calm contentment worked its way to her core. Soon, that warmth began to spread through the rest of her body. I could live my life right here. Stop the universe, just let us keep this timeless moment. Henry stopped the music, put on the video of a crackling fire, and they continued to talk of the life they wished to lead together. The warm glow she felt began to concentrate in two key points of her body, and she could feel Henry shift beneath her, trying to relieve discomfort in his pants. The conversation began to wind down, and they sat in beautiful silence for a while. Eventually, his breathing began to speed up, and she recognized him getting ready to call it a night and send her home. Oh, no, my love. Not this time. You are mine. We wanted to wait until we'd had a few peaceful days, so that it will be just us and our passion, not an attempt to let off outside frustrations, but I don't know if we will get that for a long time. No, we have waited long enough, danced around each other long enough, and I want my man. She brought her head up to start a deep, languid kiss and moved herself to straddle him. He hesitated for a moment, but she wrapped her arms around his neck to squeeze him tight and press herself against him. She began to shift her hips, grinding her pants against his, and he finally started to moo. She let the passion carry them away for a while, then broke off the kiss and leaned back so she could get lost in those deep wells of his eyes. I love you. Gods and goddess help me, I do. After all of my adventures, after living so wild and untamed, you have managed to take my hearts. He stared back into her eyes, and she saw a reflection of her own desires, higher and carnal both. I love you too. I never thought I'd say those words. Not like that. I gave up on the idea of a real love decades ago, and now here you are. I don't know how you did it, or when, but I love you, and I want to walk through this galaxy with you. She smiled, leaned forwards, and started another kiss. At length, they came up for air, and he squeezed her tight. A wry grin spread across his face, and a glint of humor twinkled in his eye. I think it is time I introduce you to a special human breakfast delicacy. She leaned forward and nibbled on his neck. Oh, breakfast delicacy, It is hardly time for breakfast yet. What shall we do in the meantime? Suddenly, she felt herself flung in the air as he surged to his feet. She let out an undignified yelp and found herself being carried in his arms. She wrapped her arms around his neck as he made for the bedroom. She giggled, her hearts hammering her breast. She couldn't tell if it was from the surprise, or her desires, or both, and she raised an eyebrow at him. So,
What exactly is this delicacy called, that I should be willing to wait here till morning for it?
Henry grinned at her and answered with laughter in his voice.
Pancakes,